New polling has former Vice President Joe Biden with a 12-point lead. Mayor Pete calls for solutions instead of polarization, and Tom Steyer qualifies for the October debate stage.
So Team Rising is here to dig in. Roger Fisk is a Democratic strategist. He previously worked for the Obama administration. And Rachel Bovard is the Senior Director of Policy at the Conservative Partnership Institute. Welcome to you both.
Great to see you guys.
Thank you.
Let's start off with something interesting I saw from Nate Silver. We were talking a lot about after this Washington Post, ABC poll, CBS poll. Basically, all signs point, Roger, to the top three candidates being Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren. Now, Nate Silver is arguing, is this really a three-candidate race? He says that the three number is arbitrary and that you can really define things however much you want. But what do you think?
First off, good morning, and thanks so much for having me.
Always glad to have you, Roger.
You know, nature abhors a vacuum, and the way I see this narrative is it's starting to create a vacuum, and neither the press or even in a lot of ways the folks on the ground are going to tolerate this narrative to just flatline between here and the caucuses.
Yeah.
Something else has to come along, right? Either the redemption story about Beto or that Mayor Pete, you know, one of these other things. It's very interesting how the bio got so many people to the dance and then they just weren't able to capitalize on it from there.
So true.
If we get into a situation where we're hitting Halloween and no one has cracked out of the tier that they're in, this becomes very interesting, because then it becomes, you know, who are there 3 tickets out of Iowa or are there 4? Then the other interesting thing to me, and I'll end here, on the second and third tier is I came across an interesting little thing on the calendar. February 3rd is not only the Iowa caucus, but it's also when early voting can begin in California.
That's right.
So how much, you know, with Texas and California moved up, how much do Senator Warren, Senator Harris and Congressman O'Rourke have, like, 1 foot in their home state? Because if they can gin that up, and I would submit that Congressman O'Rourke is in a better situation in that context than Senator Harris, all of a sudden you hit Super Tuesday, and someone could leapfrog delegate-wise, even though they're both, you know, apportioned. I believe California is by congressional district and Texas is by state Senate district or something. But that's kind of some of the interesting kind of sub-narratives coming up that I find very interesting.
Yeah. What do you think, Rachel?
Well, I think a lot of this, you know, how this troika presents itself will be apparent on Thursday, right? At this debate.
Yeah.
Because you're starting to see 2 top-tier candidates who have never faced off together, and that's one is Elizabeth Warren and the other is Joe Biden.
Yeah.
They've never been on the same debate stage, and I think now that, you know, these polls are starting to polarize, for lack of a better term, you're going to start to see them go after each other a little bit. And with Biden and Warren in particular, they have a long history of personal animosity going back to before Elizabeth Warren was a senator, back when they were doing a bankruptcy bill in 2005. She and Biden clashed over his treatment of women in the bill.
It's a great video, by the way.
You know, and
people want to
whether
pull it up.
single moms were handled well, all these things.
Yeah.
And so I think there's going to be some fireworks there, and you're going to see, I think, these lower tier candidates start to reach out and hit, I think, at some of these candidates they've avoided doing so far.
And she took a few shots at Biden over the weekend in New Hampshire, which was basically the first time we had a reporter on the ground yesterday tell us that it seemed like it was a little bit of a preview of what might come in the debates. In terms of the Nate Silver piece, I mean, look, the polls are pretty consistent at this point with the top 3, and especially if you look at the early primary states, pretty consistent with the top 3. And the other piece that I would say here is that they're all popular. Like, there's no, people are not particularly searching for, I'm not that happy with Elizabeth, I'm not that happy with Bernie Sanders. These are very popular candidates. You've got the centrist, you've got 2 flavors of progressivism, the sort of, you know, more revolutionary version, the more establishment version. So why would people move off of them at this point?
And it's interesting because, I mean, if we look at this morning consult poll, it came out last night. It's exactly the same story that we're hearing from this narrative. 33% Joe Biden, 21% Bernie Sanders, 16% Elizabeth Warren. Kamala is a drop to 7. I mean, she's basically dropping down into the single digits with Pete Buttigieg. And I talked about this earlier, Roger, but I feel like so much of her waffling, of her, oh, I misheard the question, and about her poll-tested answers is really just sinking her with so much of the progressive base that might be willing to listen. And then if you're a centrist, you have your candidate. You don't need anybody else.
Yeah, I mean, I've said this before. I think she's somewhat lost or missed the bus in a little way by not playing up. She's the chief law enforcement officer of the 6th largest economy in the world.
Right.
Like, that's a BFD, right?
Yeah.
To quote someone else.
I believe
To
Twitter
quote the
says
leading
Kamala
candidate.
is a cop.
Kamala the
That's
cop.
the thing
Yeah.
is it's fraught for her.
But
I mean,
that's
her
part of the
record
issue.
is quite
Yeah.
fraught.
Right, because I mean, the underbelly of that issue is a vulnerability for Biden. So, like, she could go after kind of the "I was a competent enforcer of the law" narrative without, and still talking about social justice and some other stuff. It's always surprised me how she didn't come out and stress that part of her bio. And then the other thing, I feel bad for whatever staff person left that memo. But this stuff happens in New Hampshire. I can fill up the rest of the show with a bunch of stories like this. But like, it's very interesting. If you ever see a printer in a New Hampshire hotel that needs paper, believe me, put paper in there because what's going to come out of that printer could be very, very interesting. And I've been in those situations. And that document is basically her campaign saying, yes, we haven't invested in New Hampshire, and here's the band-aids that we need to put over this rhetorically. So
And that there was a summer slump.
And then the last thing is like, you know, I don't know if she's going to get another bite at the kind of, you know, moment in the sun debate moment, right? Because like there's not, like, lightning doesn't strike twice.
Yeah.
They would be a very, very poor organization if they were banking on something like that being like their breakout. Because one of those things can get eyeballs and it can get clicks. But unless those rest on an actual organization that is truly plugged into where they need to be, then it's just atmospheric and it comes and goes, you know?
Well, the rumor about Kamala Harris has always been that she's great when she's rehearsed and she flubs when she's not. And I think we're starting to see that. We saw it at the second debate where Tulsi Gabbard literally dropped the Oppa book on Kamala's head and she didn't know how to handle it.
She didn't know what to say.
And
even afterwards, she didn't know how to say. All she could do was smear Tulsi.
That's right. And, you know, I think she's running away from that sort of law enforcement part of her background. And I think that tells us more about where the Democrat Party is right now than it does about Kamala herself. I mean, this is not a popular narrative among Democrats. And you're seeing as they kind of surge to the left, you know, in this primary atmosphere, they don't want to touch anything that has to do with law enforcement. Hence the hashtag Kamala is a cop.
I think you're right. So what's interesting is really splitting the difference here in the two visions so on the scene is you have Elizabeth Warren right now, we've just learned, has endorsed 2 progressive primary challenges to incumbent Democrats. This is very much a vision that something Bernie's been doing for a long time, and many of the people who support him. But
Which
she
is why
is trying.
It's not a story.
Which is
you
right,
know what I'm saying? Like it's.
But that's what's the fascinating part is she is embracing the basically primarying centrist Democrats at a time when she's taking on Joe Biden. I mean, that really does demonstrate how deep that this conflict will go. What do you think how do you think this is going to manifest itself going forward? She's just going to have to start taking him on much more clearly.
I think she's being pretty surgical about it. If it was like releasing like a slate, like here's the 34 people I want to frag, you know, that would be like a different thing. I think in at least one of those two situations, the justification behind that is probably going to be clear contrast with the NRA, because one of those individuals
has an A, Henry Cuellar in Texas.
Exactly. So I think that's kind of part of it. So I don't buy into the idea that it's fratricidal, you know, that it's like some extension of the squad and let's just go out and like mow down incumbents. Because I think it's actually much more surgical and sparse than that.
Well, it is, but I think this is a really big deal. Because it's one thing for Bernie Sanders or few rogues, you know, who are outside the establishment to endorse against their colleagues, incumbents. When you have someone who is as embedded in the establishment mainstream of the party as Elizabeth Warren, also picking progressive challengers to back in primaries against incumbents, it means the revolution has come to the party. I mean, it is inside the House.
No, I think you're taking the squad and everything, all that tension that has gone on in the House, and you are taking it to the main stage. I mean, this is full-on main stage, internecine warfare.
Well, it also shows their success, though. I mean, the AOC model, the Justice Democrats model of we are going to target these seats that should be more liberal and use this strategy to transform the shift of the party, it's been successful.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I think look at these debates that they're having in the House. You know, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her squad, for lack of a better term, are leading in this. I think there was a hashtag going around for a little bit where it was like, 4 speakers.
Yeah.
They're the ones that I think
AOC and Bernie they have set the agenda for the
and
party.
they claim that mantle. They're not
and
shy
they should.
from doing it.
I've said this here before, which is that Bernie Sanders basically already won the nomination from an Overton window perspective, which is the entire debate is, do you agree with Bernie Sanders? And if you don't, here's why.
Why?
But we're going to hear your thoughts after this. We're going to take a quick break. Sit tight.